So here's the thing about Dexter. The show is built around a very specific agreement between the audience and the writers. You agree to root for a serial killer, and in return, the writers agree to make him charming enough that you don't feel too weird about it. That's the deal. That's been the deal since the very first episode. When Michael C. Hall's voiceover slides in over that impossibly cheerful opening sequence. The egg frying, the shoelace threading, the coffee dripping, and you realize you're about to spend the next hour inside the head of a man who murders people for fun, and you're going to enjoy every minute of it. And the show pulls it off more or less, across 8 seasons of the original run, then New Blood, then Original Sin, then Resurrection. Dexter Morgan remains one of the more watchable characters television has ever produced. You shouldn't like him. You do anyway. That's the trick. But there's someone else in that show who I think deserves a longer look than he usually gets. Someone who is framed quite deliberately as the moral backbone of the whole story. The wise father, the good cop, the man who gave Dexter a reason to exist without becoming a monster. Or, well, a different kind of monster. And that's Harry Morgan. Harry is presented almost from the beginning as a figure of tragedy and care. A police officer who discovered something alarming in his adopted son and chose to address it the best way he knew how. A man who built a framework, who taught Dexter right from wrong within certain parameters, who loved him. And I've been thinking about that for a while now, because the more you actually look at what Harry did, not what the show says he did, but what he actually did step by step, decision by decision, the more it starts to look like something else entirely. This video is a long, unhurried look at Harry Morgan. Not a prosecution exactly, more of a sit-down conversation about a character the show asks us to trust without ever really asking us to scrutinize. We're going to go through the whole thing, from the affair that started it all to the suicide that ended his story, through Vogel and Brian and Deborah and the code and everything else. It takes a while. That's fine. There's no rush tonight. Something I haven't mentioned yet, but that seems worth a moment. The opening credits of Dexter. That impossibly cheerful sequence of Dexter's morning routine, the egg slicing and the meat frying and the dental floss and the orange juice and the shirt buttoning all cut to that jaunty theme. It's one of the best designed title sequences in television history, and part of what makes it so effective is that it's doing 2 things simultaneously. It's showing you how normal Dexter's surface life is, and it's showing you how that normal surface is made up of activities that have a faint echo of violence in them. The slicing, the cutting, the threading, the egg that bleeds onto the pan, the meat that is portioned with precision. Harry built that surface. The ability to have a morning routine, a job, a bowl of cereal, that's what the code was for. And the credits celebrate it, make it beautiful, make it something you hum along to every episode. That's the show's genius and its slight dishonesty in one 20-second sequence. Harry gave Dexter the ability to fry an egg and look human while doing it. And the show says, is that not something? Is that not worth something? It is. And it is also not the whole picture. Now, before we get into it, a couple of quick things. This isn't an attempt to cancel Harry Morgan, which would be a strange thing to do with a fictional character who has been dead for the entire run of the show. It's also not an attempt to completely rehabilitate Dexter, who is, after all, a serial killer. What this is, more than anything, is an attempt to push back on the show's framing just enough to see what's underneath it. Because Dexter is a show that is very skilled at directing your attention. The Miami sunshine, the cool blood work, the wry internal monologue, the genuinely excellent casting. All of it pulls you toward the story the show wants to tell, which is man with a darkness inside him shaped by a loving father into something almost tolerable, navigating an impossible life with wit and occasional grace. That's a good story. I like that story. But there's another story underneath it, slightly less comfortable, slightly less flattering to the show's most sympathetically drawn supporting character. The show ran for 8 seasons on Showtime, starting in 2006, and has since expanded into New Blood, the prequel Original Sin, and the ongoing Resurrection. Seasons 1 through 4 are some of the best television of that decade, and genuinely worth watching if you haven't. I'll explain what you need to know as we go. And if you're already familiar and you've ended up here because character analysis at this hour sounds exactly right, welcome. Put your phone down somewhere you can still half hear it. I'll keep going regardless. Let's start with the myth, because the myth is real and it matters, and you have to understand what the show is selling before you can figure out what it's not quite telling you. Harry Morgan, as presented in Dexter, is one of those characters who functions less as a person and more as an idea. He appears primarily in flashbacks and in the internal voiceover that Dexter uses to structure his decisions. And in that format, he's almost always calm, almost always right, and almost always framed in warm light. There's something slightly golden about the Harry flashbacks in the early seasons. He's got that old school cop energy, collar open, cigarette somewhere in the vicinity, the kind of face that looks like it's seen things but hasn't let them break him. The show establishes very early that Harry Morgan was, by all accounts, a legend at Miami Metro, a good cop, someone his colleagues respected, someone his superiors trusted, someone who cared about the job in the way that actual believers care about things, not just as a career, but as a calling. His partner and close friend Tom Matthews, who goes on to become deputy chief, speaks about Harry with the kind of reverence that you usually reserve for people who are either very dead or very far away. And then there's what Harry did at home, which is where the show really plants its flag. When a traumatized young boy came into Harry's life, a child who had witnessed something so horrific that it left a mark on his psychology that would never fully heal. Harry could have done any number of things. He could have committed him. He could have passed him along the foster system. He could have contacted specialists and stepped back and let the professionals handle it. Instead, he kept him. He and his wife Doris adopted Dexter Morgan, and Harry made it his project to understand what was happening inside his son's head and to try to do something useful with it. That is genuinely touching. I want to be clear about that because this video isn't about pretending Harry Morgan is a cartoon villain. He's not. The love between Harry and Dexter, the messy, complicated, ultimately catastrophic love between them, is one of the things that makes Dexter work at all. The code, which Harry builds for Dexter and which governs Dexter's behavior as a killer throughout the original series, is presented as his great achievement. A moral framework imposed on something that doesn't naturally have morality. A set of rules that makes the killing not just survivable, but arguably justifiable within a certain logic. Only kill those who have themselves killed and escape the system's notice. Only take those who deserve it. And above all else, don't get caught. The show gives us Harry's ghost throughout the series, appearing in mirrors and quiet moments, functioning as Dexter's conscience. When Dexter's about to do something reckless, Harry's face shows up and says something measured. When Dexter loses his way, Harry's voice brings him back. He's the internal ballast, the father who keeps his son from going fully off the rails. And it works. As storytelling, it really does. The hallucination device is one of those things that could easily tip into being annoying or unconvincing, and James Remar makes it work through sheer warmth. There's something real in those scenes. Even when the Harry in Dexter's head is gently telling him off, there's affection underneath it. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The Harry in Dexter's head is not Harry. He's what Dexter needed Harry to be. He's the version of his father that Dexter constructed to help himself survive, and the version of his father that the show wants us to accept. The actual Harry, the one who existed in the real timeline, made a sequence of choices that produced a very different outcome than the myth suggests. And the gap between those two Harrys, the legend and the man, is what the rest of this video is about. There's also something worth noting about how the show handles Harry structurally. Because he died before the series begins, we only ever see him through the lens of people who loved him, or through flashbacks that are filtered through Dexter's memory and Dexter's need for his father to have been good. He never gets to defend himself in real time. He never gets cross-examined. He gets to remain a saint because saints don't age and don't contradict themselves and don't have to face what they've done. The living characters who knew Harry, Matthews, Camilla the file clerk, the old colleagues, all speak of him in hushed, respectful tones. The only person who challenges the Harry narrative directly, who says out loud that Harry wasn't the man everyone thought he was, is Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, the villain of Season 1. Which is funny if you think about it. The show's most accurate Harry Morgan critic is also its most obvious monster. That's not an accident, I think. It's a very neat way of making sure you don't take the criticism seriously. And since we're talking about structure, it's worth noting how the flashback format specifically benefits Harry's reputation within the show. Every time we see him in the past, it's because Dexter is thinking about him. And Dexter is almost always thinking about him in the context of needing guidance, needing comfort, or needing to understand something difficult. The Harry of the flashbacks is therefore always the Harry that Dexter needs him to be in that specific moment. He's responsive, he's relevant, he says the right thing. What we never get is the boring Harry, the distracted Harry, the Harry who was tired or short-tempered or got something wrong and had to apologize. The format filters out everything but the meaningful, and in doing so produces a portrait that is, by definition, incomplete. There's also a detail worth noting about the recurring mythology of Harry as a cop that I think shapes how we receive everything else about him. The show repeatedly tells us he was a legend at Miami Metro. His colleagues speak of him with reverence, his superiors trusted him implicitly, and even his enemies, or the people who might have reason to be critical, tend to acknowledge that he was good at the job. That's a very specific kind of social credibility, and it functions as a kind of preemptive defense. We trust police officers who are respected by other police officers, at least within the world of a police procedural. The institution vouches for Harry, and we extend that institutional credibility to everything else about him, which is convenient, given what everything else about him turns out to be. It's also worth sitting with the fact that Dexter's internal Harry is explicitly identified over the course of the series as a construction. By season 8, Dexter himself begins to interrogate whether the voice in his head is actually his father or just the version of his father he needs. That's a more honest framing than the earlier seasons offer, and it's the framing that I think is closest to the truth. Harry, the hallucination, is Dexter's creation, shaped by Dexter's grief and need, and it tells us more about what Dexter needed from his father than about what Harry Morgan actually was. Everything in Dexter's life, and I mean everything, traces back to a shipping container at the port of Miami. That's where his story actually begins. Not with Harry finding him, not with the adoption, not with the code, with a woman named Laura Moser and what happened to her and why it happened. Laura Moser was a criminal informant working under Harry Morgan. She was feeding him intelligence on a drug trafficker named Hector Estrada, who was running a significant operation out of Miami. Harry was using her to get inside Estrada's network to gather the kind of information that would let him make a real case. This is, on the surface, standard police work. Informants are a normal part of how investigations function, especially narcotics investigations in Miami in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which was not a gentle time or place. But Harry was also having an affair with Laura Moser. We see this developed in detail in Original Sin, the prequel series, where Christian Slater plays a younger Harry navigating the early stages of the operation. He and Laura had an intimate relationship while she was officially his asset. She was, in the clearest possible terms, a vulnerable person in a dangerous situation who was dependent on Harry both professionally and personally. And Harry, a married man with a family at home, was sleeping with her. I don't want to morally lecture about this at length because I think most people can identify the problem themselves. But I do want to name it clearly because the show tends to keep it slightly soft. Harry's affair with Laura is a fact that the series acknowledges, sometimes reluctantly, but it never quite sits with the implications of it. An officer of the law using a woman as an informant, someone whose safety he is professionally obligated to protect, while simultaneously conducting an affair with her is not a gray area. That's an abuse of a power differential, even if both parties are technically willing. And then things got much worse. Laura's cover was blown. The operation went sideways. Santos Jimenez, working for Estrada, took Laura and her 2 young sons to a shipyard. Harry followed, lost the car, and was too late. In that container at the docks, Hector Estrada had Laura Moser dismembered with a chainsaw in front of her children. Dexter was approximately 2 or 3 years old. His brother Brian was slightly older. They were both in the container when it happened. They both saw it. That's the origin of everything. The trauma that would eventually become the dark passenger, the dissociation, the inability to connect normally to other people. All of it lives in that shipping container and what those 2 small boys witnessed. And that container exists because Harry put Laura Moser in a position where it could happen. Now, Harry didn't order the hit. He didn't want Laura dead. He was devastated. You can see that in the flashbacks, and it reads as genuine. But wanting something desperately and being responsible for it are not mutually exclusive. Harry sent Laura further and further into danger because the operation required it, because he was focused on Estrada, because the goal of the case mattered more than the risk to his informant. He was demoted when the affair became known, which suggests that the people around him did not consider his conduct acceptable either. There's also a detail that I find particularly uncomfortable, which is that Harry apparently had other informants he was also involved with. A character named Valerie, who appears briefly in Season 4, describes herself as Harry's CI fuck buddy and mentions that he dumped her for another CI. So this was not a one-time lapse in judgment, this was a pattern. The show, to its credit, does let this information land when it comes out. Deborah, who spent her entire life idolizing her father, is visibly shaken when she starts piecing it together in Season 4. There's a scene where she's standing outside a house that used to belong to Laura Moser, learning for the first time that her dad's CI, the woman who died in that horrible way, was someone Harry had been involved with. And you can see Deborah recalibrating something in her head. But the show doesn't fully commit to the implications. Harry is still eulogized. Matthew still says Harry made the right call. The official verdict within the world of the series is that Harry did his best in a difficult situation, and the tragedy was an acceptable consequence of the work. I'm not sure I agree with that. And I think if you look at the downstream consequences, Dexter in a shipping container watching his mother die, Brian Moser in that same container, the trajectory of both of their lives from that moment. I think you can make a reasonable case that Harry Morgan's decisions in those years cost a great deal more than just one woman's life. It cost Dexter a childhood he could actually live inside. It cost Brian Moser everything. It cost Laura Moser her life and her sons their sanity. And it started with Harry using a woman as an asset and sleeping with her and sending her back into danger because the case needed her to go. One more thing, since we're on the topic, Harry shows up at that shipping yard after the massacre and finds the two boys. And what does he do? He takes one of them home, which is where we're going next. Something I find interesting about the way the Laura Moser material is handled across the franchise is how carefully the show staggers the revelations. You don't get the full picture all at once. The affair is confirmed over Season 4. The full timeline of what happened at the docks and Harry's role in putting Laura in danger comes together gradually across multiple seasons and is then expanded considerably in Original Sin. The effect of this staggering is that each individual revelation feels like a limited thing, a specific new piece of information rather than a cumulative pattern. But when you put all the pieces together chronologically, the pattern is considerably more troubling. Harry used a woman as an informant, began a personal relationship with her, continued using her as an informant, sent her deeper into a dangerous operation, and she died. He then adopted her son, kept the truth about her death and the circumstances around it secret from that son for decades, and used his institutional connections to ensure that certain records were either omitted or buried. That's not one mistake. That's a sustained course of action over many years, each step of which reflected a choice about whose interests to protect and whose to sacrifice. There's also something I want to note about the Valerie detail because it's easy to let it slide by given how briefly it appears. Valerie, the woman who turns up in Season 4 to mention casually that she was Harry's CI fuck buddy before he moved on to another informant, suggests that Harry's pattern with Laura was not aberrant. He had a type. He used the people in his professional orbit for personal purposes. That's a pattern of behavior, not an isolated lapse in judgment, and it matters for how we understand his character. And one more thing, since we're being thorough, Harry's choice to adopt Dexter and raise him while generous in one light is also readable as a way of managing his own guilt. He could not give Laura Moser back her life. He could not undo what his choices contributed to. but he could take her surviving son into his home and provide for him and tell himself that he was making amends. That doesn't make the adoption wrong. Children need homes, and Dexter needed one. But guilt-motivated generosity and pure generosity are different things, and the show's framing tends toward the purer version. Let me also say something about the specific professional ethics involved, because I think people sometimes hand-wave this in a way that obscures how serious it was. An informant working for a police officer is not in a peer relationship with that officer. They are, by definition, in a position of dependence. Their safety depends on how well the officer manages the operation. Their continued freedom often depends on the officer's goodwill. Informants are frequently people who have their own legal exposure, which is precisely what makes them useful as informants. The power differential is structural, not incidental, and having a personal relationship with someone in that structural position is not ethically neutral. Harry was not a private citizen who happened to fall for a woman in a difficult situation. He was the person whose professional decisions directly determined whether she lived or died. He had operational control over how deeply she was inserted into danger. And he was sleeping with her. Whatever Laura Moser felt about that relationship, and we see enough of her in the flashbacks to believe she had genuine feelings. The conditions under which it began and continued were not conditions of equals. This matters for the question of Harry's character not because it makes him monstrous, but because it reveals something about how he related to the people in his care. He used them, not maliciously, not without feeling, but he used them nonetheless. He used Laura as an informant and as a partner, and when she died, he used her children as a way of managing his guilt. He used Brian briefly and discarded him. He used Dexter as a project and a purpose, and, in his imagined future, possibly as some kind of ongoing proof that he'd done something right. The pattern is not, Harry was a bad man. The pattern is, Harry was someone who related to other people partly in terms of what they could do for him, even when he cared about them. That's not villainy, but it's also not the uncomplicated heroism that the mythology requires. Here's the part that I think gets underexplored, partly because the show is very careful about how it presents it, and partly because Brian Moser ends up doing such unambiguously terrible things that it's easy to take Harry's side by default. But I want to try not to do that because the question of what happened to Brian Moser is genuinely important to understanding Harry Morgan. After the massacre at the docks, Harry and his wife Doris took in both boys, Dexter and Brian Moser, as foster children initially, with the intention of adopting them both. For a brief period they were together, two traumatized children in one house, with a police officer and his wife trying to figure out what to do with them. Brian showed signs of serious disturbance very early. He nearly smothered infant Deborah. He attacked Harry physically when Harry tried to discipline him. Child Protective Services raised concerns. It became clear, relatively quickly, that Brian was a danger to the other children in the household. And so Harry made a choice. He kept Dexter and sent Brian away. Specifically, Brian went into the foster care system, cycling through homes and eventually ending up in a psychiatric facility called Harbor Light Mental Hospital, where he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as an adult. He grew up with no family, no permanence, no person who stayed. He spent years institutionalized. He eventually became the ice truck killer, tracking down his brother across Miami, leaving exsanguinated bodies posed for Dexter to find, staging an elaborate reunion that ended with Dexter having to kill him. Now, here's where I have to be careful, because I don't want to make an argument I don't actually believe. I don't think Harry should have kept Brian in the house if Brian was genuinely endangering Deborah. That's a real constraint. You can't prioritize one child's trauma over another child's physical safety, and Deborah was an infant who couldn't protect herself. If Brian was a genuine danger to her, Harry's immediate choice to remove him isn't hard to understand. But what happened after that is, Harry placed Brian in the system, and, as far as the show indicates, never look back. There's no evidence that Harry advocated for Brian's treatment, no evidence that he visited, no evidence that he stayed in contact or monitored what was happening to a small child he had briefly fostered, a child who had witnessed the same horror as Dexter, a child who had the same needs. Harry chose Dexter in the most complete sense of that word. Dexter got the father, the family, the code, the attention, the entire framework of Harry's moral investment. Brian got a social worker and a series of institutions. In Original Sin, Brian directly confronts Harry with this at gunpoint. He tells Harry that he knows about the affair with Laura, that he knows Harry sent her into danger, that he knows Harry chose one brother and discarded the other. And none of those accusations are wrong. Brian is not a reliable narrator. He's a serial killer at this point, and he has every reason to want to hurt Harry. But the facts he's citing are accurate. There's something almost unbearably sad about Brian Moser when you think about him this way. He didn't choose to be in that container. He didn't choose to see what he saw. He didn't choose to end up in Harbor Light. He was handed a particular starting point by circumstances entirely beyond his control, and then the person who had the power to intervene chose to intervene for someone else. The show frames Brian as Dexter's antagonist and ultimately as an obstacle that Dexter has to remove. And in narrative terms, that's what he is. But in human terms, Brian Moser is a child who is abandoned by the one adult who could have made a difference, and who spent the rest of his life proving that abandonment right in the most destructive way possible. There's a cruel irony in how the code worked here, if you want to trace it. Harry taught Dexter to redirect his violent impulses toward people who deserved to die, people who had killed and escaped justice. The code, supposedly, is about righteous killing. But Harry's decision to abandon Brian contributed to the creation of a killer who was not covered by the code. When Brian started murdering people, Dexter couldn't let him go. The code couldn't excuse him. So Dexter killed his own brother, with Harry's voice in his head presumably approving of the decision. Harry built a system designed to manage one traumatized child's violence, and in the process created a second traumatized child's violence, which the first traumatized child then had to clean up. If that's not a kind of villainy, I'm not sure what you'd call it. I also want to note something smaller but telling. Brian, in his confrontation with Harry, says that Harry never told Dexter about him. Harry kept the existence of Dexter's biological brother secret. He gave Dexter a new birth certificate, a new name, a new identity, and a false story about his past. The brother who existed, who was out there in institutions, who eventually grew into someone looking desperately for connection, was someone Dexter had no idea about. That's a lie of omission that lasted decades, and it's one of several. I want to spend a bit more time on what Brian's life actually looked like, because the show gives us glimpses of it, but doesn't dwell there, and I think dwelling matters. Harbor Light Mental Hospital was where Brian ended up eventually. Before that, there were the foster homes. Multiple placements disrupted by Brian's behavior, each one ending and requiring another. For a child who had already experienced profound abandonment and witnessed something catastrophic, the cycle of foster placements, each one failing, each one ending in another removal, would have been an ongoing replication of the original abandonment. You are placed somewhere, you are disruptive, you are removed. You are placed somewhere else, you are removed again. The message that this process sends to a child about their own worth and about the reliability of care is not a subtle one. By the time Brian reaches adulthood, he has been told by the world in the clearest possible terms that he is not keepable. He is the child that people take in and then send away. And the specific person who most clearly enacted this message was the police officer who initially took him in, considered him, and sent him away while keeping his brother. The ice truck killer's kill-ins are interesting in this context if you want to read them psychologically rather than just as plot mechanics. Brian kills women, drains their blood, leaves them displayed in positions that are almost clinical, almost peaceful. There's no gore. There's a strange care to the presentation. It reads, to multiple characters in the show, and to a fair number of viewers, as the work of someone trying to communicate something about their own history, about dismemberment, about blood, about the removal of all the mess from something that started out violent. He's trying to find his brother. He's trying to show Dexter that he understands, that he was there too, that they share something that nobody else can share. That's not exculpatory. Brian Moser murdered people, and he would have murdered Deborah, and these things are not acceptable. But the trajectory from the shipping container to Harbor Light to the ice truck killer is, when you lay it out, not inexplicable. It's the predictable output of a particular set of inputs, most of which had Harry Morgan's fingerprints on them. What gets me quietly is that Brian and Dexter were the same age, from the same place, with the same original trauma. The difference in their outcomes: Dexter functional enough to hold a job and have relationships. Brian institutionalized and eventually a murderer, is almost entirely attributable to one man's decision about which child to keep. That's a very heavy thing to carry on one human choice. I find myself thinking sometimes about what that conversation might have looked like if Harry had ever tried to have it. If he'd gone to Harbor Light or whatever institution Brian was in at some point and sat across from him and said, I know I made a choice. I know it was a choice that hurt you. I'm sorry. We know that never happened because Brian's entire adult life is shaped by the wound of Harry's abandonment, and you don't carry that wound the way Brian clearly did if the man ever showed up and tried to address it. But the imagining of it reveals something about Harry. He didn't go. He had the means and presumably eventually the awareness. He could have found Brian, he chose not to. One reading of that is that Harry was afraid of what Brian represented. A reminder of the failure of his management of the Moser operation, a living embodiment of the choice he'd made to save one child and lose another. Brian's existence was uncomfortable. Looking at him would require looking at things Harry had spent considerable effort not looking at. Staying away was easier. Another reading is that Harry had simply decided at some point that Brian was a lost cause, that whatever had been set in motion in those early years was irreversible, and there was nothing to be gained from reopening it. That's a colder calculation, and it fits less well with the Harry the show wants us to love, but it fits quite well with the Harry who built a risk management system and called it a code. Either way, Brian Moser lived his entire life without the person most responsible for the shape of that life ever acknowledging it. That's an absence that has a weight to it. The code is the thing. If you ask most Dexter fans what Harry Morgan's legacy is, they'll say, the code. It's the show's central conceit, the thing that separates Dexter from every other fictional serial killer, the moral framework that makes his story something other than pure horror. Harry gave Dexter a system. That system made Dexter a person with a purpose rather than just a man with a compulsion. And the code is real in the sense that it shapes everything Dexter does across 8 seasons of television. He genuinely follows it mostly, he vets his targets, he confirms guilt, he builds the kill room only after he's satisfied beyond any reasonable doubt that the person on the table deserves to be there. There's a procedural rigor to the way Dexter approaches his work that is, in its own very strange way, almost admirable. But I want to look at the actual rules of the code, because the show talks about them a lot without always being precise about what they are and in what order. Here's the thing that comes up in Season 8, when Dr. Evelyn Vogel, who we'll get to properly later, is explaining to Dexter how the code was constructed. She says, and I'm paraphrasing from memory here, when Harry and I came up with the code, he insisted that you only kill bad people. And I insisted that the first rule of the code be don't get caught, giving you a little wiggle room. Read that again, slowly. The first rule of the Code of Harry is not only kill guilty people, it's don't get caught. That's not a moral framework. That's a risk management strategy with moral window dressing. Think about what that means in practice. The code tells Dexter that the most important thing before everything else, before justice and before innocence and before the rightness of any particular kill, is his own survival and concealment. The killing of guilty people is the philosophy. The not getting caught is the operating principle. And when those two things come into conflict, the operating principle wins. And you can see this throughout the series if you're watching for it. Dexter kills Dokes' evidence and frames him as the Bay Harbor Butcher, partly because the code requires that he survive. He withholds information from people who could use it to save lives because the code requires that he not be found out. He makes decisions that hurt people he genuinely cares about because the first rule is always not getting caught. Now, Vogel's contribution to the don't get caught rule is important, and I want to note it. She says she was the one who insisted on it, but Harry accepted it. Harry built a system in which his son's survival took precedence over abstract justice and then called it a moral code. That's a particular kind of intellectual dishonesty. There's also something worth examining in who the code actually protects. Not Dexter's victims, who had no say in the process, who couldn't appeal the verdict, who relied entirely on Dexter's assessment of their guilt. Not the people around Dexter who were put in danger by proximity to him their entire lives. The code protects Dexter. And in protecting Dexter, it protects Harry's legacy, because if Dexter gets caught, Harry gets implicated. The man who built this weapon is attached to it. The code gave Harry something very valuable, which was the ability to believe he had done the right thing. He could tell himself, and in some sense it seems he did tell himself right up until the moment he couldn't, that he hadn't created a monster. He'd created a tool. He'd applied guardrails. He'd directed the violence somewhere useful. The code was Harry's conscience management system as much as it was Dexter's behavior management system. And here's another thing about the code that I find genuinely interesting, which is that it never once asks what's best for Dexter. It's entirely instrumental. It tells Dexter what to do, what not to do, how to avoid getting caught, what kind of targets are acceptable. It says nothing about Dexter's internal life, his psychological health, his long-term well-being, his ability to have relationships, his capacity to be happy. The code is not designed to help Dexter thrive. It's designed to help Dexter function without being arrested. Compare that to what actual therapeutic intervention might have looked like. We know now because the science exists now in a way it didn't in the 1970s. That early childhood trauma of the severity Dexter experienced is treatable. Not curable, not simple, but treatable. There are documented cases of children with similar presentations, violent ideation, trauma-based dissociation, attachment difficulties, who, with consistent specialized support over years, became adults who could live in the world without harming others. Harry never tried that. Harry and Vogel looked at Dexter and concluded his urges were unfixable and pivoted almost immediately to, how do we make this workable? That's a very fast conclusion to draw about a small child. And it's a conclusion that conveniently aligned with what Harry wanted, which was to keep Dexter, to not lose another person, to not have to face what his own actions had contributed to. The code is a beautiful piece of television mythology. It's also, when you look at it clearly, a set of instructions for a weapon, and Harry is the man who wrote those instructions and handed them to a child, and told the child they were his identity. There's another angle on the code that I find worth exploring, which is the question of what it was designed to do for Harry psychologically, separate from what it was designed to do for Dexter behaviorally. The code functions in Harry's internal life as a way of converting something morally unbearable into something morally defensible. Without the code, what Harry has done is recognize that his adopted son is likely to kill people and done nothing to stop him except watch. With the code, what Harry has done is recognize that his adopted son is likely to kill people and directed that tendency toward a socially useful end. The second framing is substantially more comfortable to live inside than the first. This matters because the code is as much about Harry's psychology as it is about Dexter's. It gives Harry a narrative. It gives him a way of saying, I made the best of a terrible situation, rather than I created a serial killer and then built him a permission structure. The emotional labor that the code does for Harry, the way it lets him sleep at night or tries to, is not incidental to its construction. It's baked in. And then there's the question of enforcement, which is worth a paragraph. Who enforces the code? Harry is dead. Vogel monitors Dexter occasionally, but has her own interests at stake. The code is essentially self-policed by a person who has a strong interest in interpreting its rules in the ways that are most convenient for him. Dexter does occasionally break the code. He kills an innocent person at one point, and kills in situations that don't clearly meet his own standard of confirmed guilt. And the consequences are not much. The code has no external enforcement mechanism. It relies entirely on Dexter's own willingness to follow it, which is variable. That's a design flaw of some significance. A moral framework with no accountability built into it is, in practice, just a set of preferences. And Dexter's preferences, as the series makes clear, are heavily shaped by his own emotional state, his relationships, his immediate circumstances. The code bends. Harry built something that he said was rigid and that is actually quite flexible. And he built the flexibility in so that Dexter could survive, because a rigid code might eventually require Dexter to turn himself in. There's one more thing about the code that feels important to name, and it's something the show deals with in Season 3 in a way that I find genuinely illuminating. Dexter forms a friendship, or something like it, with Miguel Prado, an ADA who discovers Dexter's secret and initially seems to want to use it for good. The partnership breaks down badly when Miguel starts using Dexter's methods to kill people who are not code compliant, people who are politically inconvenient rather than genuinely guilty of murder. Dexter ends up killing Miguel because Miguel has violated the code. But here's what's interesting about that arc. The reason Dexter can identify Miguel's violation as a violation is because the code has a specific enough set of rules that deviation from it is detectable, which means the code has real content, real standards, and yet the code has no enforcement mechanism except Dexter's own conscience. The moment Dexter decides that Miguel needs to die, he's making a judgment call that is outside the code's scope. The code doesn't say kill people who abuse the code. Dexter is improvising, and he does this throughout the series. He kills people who threaten him, not just people who meet the target criteria. He makes exceptions. He bends the rules in situations where the rules are inconvenient. The code is rigidly presented, but flexibly applied, and the flexibility is always in the direction of Dexter's survival and comfort. Harry presumably knew this would happen. You can't build a rule system for a person and expect the person never to interpret the rules in their own favor. The code was always going to be somewhat elastic because it was always going to be applied by someone with their own interests and emotions and situational pressures. Harry either didn't think this through or thought it through and decided it was acceptable. Either way the code is implemented is not the code as described. Season 8 of Dexter is, depending on who you ask, a mixed bag. Some people find it a satisfying conclusion, some find it a frustrating one, and a lot of people have complicated feelings about the finale specifically. But whatever you think of Season 8 as television, it contains something that I think is one of the most genuinely important revelations in the entire franchise, and it concerns Dr. Evelyn Vogel. Vogel, played by Charlotte Rampling, is introduced as a neuropsychiatrist with a specialty in psychopathy. She wrote the book on it. Literally, she's published multiple volumes, she's lectured widely, she's considered a leading authority. She comes into Dexter's orbit when she shows up at Miami Metro as a consultant on a particularly unusual murder, and it becomes clear very quickly that she knows things about Dexter that she shouldn't. The reveal is that Vogel was there at the beginning. She was the specialist Harry went to when Dexter was a child, when Harry was at the end of his rope trying to understand what was happening inside his son's head. The specific moment that brought Harry to Vogel is worth sitting with for a second. Dexter, aged around 10, kept asking to be taken to a crime scene. Harry resisted for a while and then relented, hoping it would shock the boy out of whatever was going on with him. Instead, Dexter was fascinated. He wasn't disturbed by the blood at all. On the way home, Harry noticed that Dexter had stolen a piece of bloodied glass from the scene. He kept it, like a souvenir. Harry broke down. He went to Vogel convinced that something was catastrophically wrong with his son, and Vogel confirmed it. She agreed that Dexter showed all the classic traits of a psychopath, that he would inevitably become a killer, and that the question was not whether this would happen, but what form it would take. She told Harry there was a place in the world for his son. She didn't know what it was yet, but they would find it together. And so they found it. Together. They tried hunting animals first, giving Dexter a channel for the urge that didn't involve people. That wasn't enough. Eventually, they arrived at the idea of directing the killing toward people who had themselves killed and escaped the law's reach. Vogel says the code was her idea and concept, though Harry brought the specifics of his law enforcement background to the details. Now, think about what this actually is. A police officer and a psychiatrist sat down with a traumatized child and decided between them that the best course of action was to train him to be an efficient serial killer with good target selection. They didn't pursue conventional therapy. They didn't seek other specialist opinions. They ran what was, in all practical terms, an experiment on a child, designing a psychological framework that would make one particular kind of violence functional and everything else suppressible. Dexter says this directly to Vogel when he finds out. "You experimented on me." She doesn't deny it. She defends it by saying that without the code, he would have ended up on death row or in an institution for the rest of his life, and that her intervention saved him. And maybe that's true, maybe it is, but "I saved your life by turning you into a more efficient weapon" is not the same thing as care, and the show sometimes conflates the two. There's also a particular line from Vogel in Season 8 that I find fascinating and slightly chilling, and it concerns the question of why Dexter never killed Deborah after she found out about him. Vogel asks him directly, "When your sister found out about who you were and what you were doing, why didn't you kill her?" And then she tells him that a psychopath's love for another person is defined by what that person does for the psychopath, not by genuine care for the other person. She describes Dexter's attachment to Deborah as something like enlightened self-interest dressed up as love. She might be right about that, but think about who is saying it. The woman who designed Dexter's psychological framework is now telling him that the emotional connections he thought were real are probably not. She helped create him, and she's now evaluating him, and her evaluation serves to confirm her original thesis. He is what she made him. He is the experiment, and the experiment is still running. Vogel comes across in a lot of the fandom discussion I've read as a largely sympathetic character. Someone who cared about Dexter, who tried to help, who ended up being tragically killed by a former patient. And I understand that reading. Charlotte Rampling brings a lot of warmth to the role, and the scenes between her and Dexter are often genuinely moving. But I keep coming back to what she actually did. She looked at a traumatized 10-year-old and decided, on the basis of his symptom profile, that the most useful thing to do with him was to train him to kill people. She collaborated with a police officer, a person with no psychiatric credentials, to design a psychological intervention that no ethics board would ever have approved. She treated Dexter as a subject and the code as her work, and his ongoing life as evidence for her theories. In Season 8, when she asks Dexter to hunt a killer for her because she's afraid of being exposed for unorthodox and illegal methods in treating psychopaths, the circle closes on something uncomfortable. The methods that produced Dexter were themselves unorthodox and illegal, and Vogel has been quietly benefiting from what they produced ever since. Harry doesn't get off cleanly in this either. He went to Vogel out of desperation and love, and those are real. But he also accepted the framework she offered without, as far as we can tell, seriously questioning it. He handed his son over to an experiment because the experiment offered a path forward that kept Harry's family intact and Harry's conscience manageable. 2 adults, 1 traumatized child. A system designed by 2 adults for the child's management, not his healing. That's what the Code of Harry is at its origin. One thing I keep thinking about in relation to the Vogel revelation is the question of informed consent, which is an interesting thing to raise in the context of a fictional serial killer and his fictional psychiatrist, but bear with me. Dexter, as a child, did not consent to the code. He did not sit down with Harry and Vogel and agree that yes, this framework for his life made sense to him, that he accepted the terms. He was a child. He was shaped by the people responsible for him in the direction they chose for reasons that had as much to do with their own needs as with his. The code was imposed on Dexter, not agreed to by him. And while that's true of most parenting decisions are not, we're going to train you to be a serial killer with good target selection. This comes up in the series obliquely. Dexter at various points questions the code, tests it, resents it, and occasionally finds himself wondering if he would have chosen it given the choice. The dark passenger conversation in Season 8 is part of this. The question of whether Dexter's violence is really something external to him, something he can blame on the trauma in the wiring, or whether it's actually his own desire that he's been encouraged to enact under the cover of a morality system that wasn't his idea. There's also something I find quietly devastating in the DVD recordings that Vogel shows Dexter of Harry's sessions with her. Because those recordings capture Harry in real time, working through his doubts, his fears, his uncertainty about whether any of this is right. The Harry in those recordings is genuinely troubled. He's not a man who thought the plan was obviously good and executed it with confidence. He's a man who was afraid and improvising and hoping it would work out. That's humanizing in its way. It's also a bit alarming because you're essentially watching a frightened man and an ambitious specialist design the psychological architecture of another person's entire life, in real time, without any clear sense that they know what they're doing. The recordings Dexter watches in Season 8 tell him that Harry continued to have doubts right up until the end. He kept going back to Vogel. He kept checking in on the project. He kept trying to make sure it was working, and when it was clearly working, when Dexter made his first kill and told Harry cheerfully, Harry's reaction was complicated in ways that suggested he wasn't as confident as he'd presented himself to be. The code looked good on paper. It worked rather differently in practice. There's also a dimension to the Vogel relationship that I want to address, which is the question of what Vogel got out of it. Because Vogel isn't entirely a sympathetic figure, and her interest in Dexter isn't purely altruistic. She wrote books about psychopathy. She built a career on the study of people like Dexter. When she tells Dexter in Season 8 that she came to care for him and still does, I believe her. I think the feeling is real. But I also think that Dexter, over the years, has functioned as her primary case study. He is the most successful example of the framework she designed. If the code works, if Dexter is functional, if he's avoided capture, if he's maintained a life, then Vogel's thesis is validated. Her professional reputation, her books, her standing in her field, all of it rests in part on Dexter continuing to be what she designed him to be. That's a conflict of interest. It doesn't mean she doesn't care about him, but it means that her care for him as a person is entangled with her investment in him as evidence. And when those two things pull in different directions, when what would genuinely be best for Dexter as a person conflicts with what maintains Vogel's version of the project, there's no guarantee that the person wins. Harry doesn't get this conflict of interest because Harry is dead and his investment is different. But Harry accepted Vogel's framework without fully accounting for what Vogel's investment in it was. He was desperate for an answer, and Vogel offered one, and the answer happened to serve Vogel's professional interests as well as Harry's personal ones. That's worth sitting with. Harry Morgan was a man who kept a lot of things to himself. This is, on one level, understandable. He was a police officer, he was dealing with information that could destroy multiple lives, and he had a genuine instinct toward protection. But the cumulative weight of what he concealed and who he concealed it from is something worth laying out properly because it changes the picture considerably. Let's go through it. From Dexter. Harry concealed Dexter's biological origins. He gave Dexter a new surname, a new birth certificate, a new family identity. Dexter grew up not knowing who Laura Moser was, not knowing the full story of the shipping container massacre, not knowing that his biological brother Brian was alive and out there somewhere. He knew vaguely that he'd been adopted and that his birth parents had died in some kind of tragedy. That was the official story. The truth, that Harry had been having an affair with his biological mother, that Harry's own actions as a police officer had contributed to the situation that put Laura Moser in danger, that Brian had been deliberately separated from him and sent into the system, all of that was simply withheld. This matters because Dexter spends the entire series trying to understand himself. His voiceover is full of questions about who he is, what made him this way, whether the emptiness inside him is something fundamental or something situational. He carries this deeply uncertain sense of his own nature right through to the end of the franchise. And the man who could have given him some actual context, who could have said, here is your history, here is what happened, here is what I know about where you came from and what it might have done to you, chose instead to construct a fiction and leave Dexter inside it. From Deborah. Deborah got the worst of this in some ways, because she was the legitimate child. She was Harry's biological daughter, and she grew up with an almost comically idealized image of her father. She spent her entire career at Miami Metro in his shadow, trying to be good enough, trying to earn the same reputation. She referred to him constantly, invoked him as a standard, measured herself against what she thought he was. And Harry let her do that without ever telling her the truth. He never told her about the affair with Laura. He never told her about the real circumstances of Dexter's adoption, about Brian's existence, about the code, about any of it. Deborah grew up in a house where enormous things were happening in the room next door, and her father kept the door locked. When Deborah finally starts piecing it together in season 4, finding out about Laura Moser, realizing that Dexter's biological brother became the ice truck killer who nearly killed her, learning that Harry knew about all of this, you can see something shift in her. The idol has a crack in it. And the crack keeps widening through seasons 5, 6, 7, and 8 as the full shape of Harry's deceptions becomes clearer. From Doris, his wife. The show doesn't spend a lot of time on Doris, who had already died by the time the series begins. But she was Harry's wife, and she co-adopted both boys initially, and she went along with the decision to send Brian away. Whether Harry told her the full truth about the affair with Laura, about why Dexter was so troubled, about the arrangement with Vogel, the show doesn't say definitively. But given Harry's general disposition toward keeping things compartmentalized, it seems unlikely Doris had the full picture. From his colleagues and superiors, Harry used his institutional position to protect his secrets. Matthews covered up the circumstances of Harry's death. Camilla, the file clerk, quietly omitted Dexter's name from certain records to protect him. The network of institutional protection Harry built around his family extended into the police department itself, and it was built on relationships of trust that Harry was exploiting. What's interesting about all of this is that the one person who kept trying to tell the truth, or at least to surface the truth in a destructive way, was Brian. Brian knew about the affair. He knew about the container. He knew Harry had chosen one child and abandoned the other. And the reason Brian's version of events is the most accurate is precisely because he was the one who wasn't protected by Harry's story. He had every reason to know the truth and no reason to keep quiet about it. There's a structural irony in the show's framing here that I find genuinely interesting. The primary keeper of uncomfortable Harry truths is the ice truck killer. The man who vouches for Harry and buries the real story is the deputy chief of police. The show, perhaps unintentionally, is telling you something about who controls narratives and who doesn't, about whose version of events gets memorialized and whose gets locked in a file cabinet. Harry's deceptions weren't malicious in the way that a cartoon villain's deceptions would be. He wasn't lying to anyone for profit or power. He was lying to protect people in his own estimation. But the specific people he was protecting, himself, his reputation, his ability to believe he'd done the right thing, were not always the people he told himself he was protecting. And the people who actually bore the cost of the secrets were the ones he claimed to love most. That's a particular kind of dishonesty, the kind where the lies feel like care from the inside. It's also worth noting the sheer institutional power that Harry used to maintain his secrets, because it wasn't just a matter of personal decisions. He had actual leverage. Matthews was Harry's partner and closest colleague, and he used that relationship to ensure that the real circumstances of Harry's death were buried. The autopsy was adjusted. The official cause of death was changed. An entire legal and bureaucratic record was altered to protect Harry's reputation. That's not one man keeping his own secrets. That's an institution helping him keep them because the institution has its own interest in Harry being remembered well. Camilla, the file clerk at Miami Metro, quietly omitted Dexter's name from certain records related to the Moser case, specifically to protect him. She did this out of loyalty to Harry, which means Harry had cultivated relationships throughout the department that functioned as a shadow infrastructure for the protection of his family. Everyone who knew Harry at Miami Metro knew, on some level, that he had a particular situation with his son. And the culture of loyalty he'd built meant that the people around him would go out of their way to cover for that situation without being asked. That's not nothing. That's a network of complicity built over years that functioned to insulate Harry's choices from any meaningful accountability. And it extended all the way through to Deborah, who spent much of seasons 7 and 8 covering for Dexter in ways that clearly echoed how the institution had been covering for Harry all along. The pattern reproduced itself. There's one more person I want to mention in the context of Harry's deceptions, which is Rita. Rita Bennett, who became Rita Morgan, who was the person most immediately destroyed by the consequences of Harry's framework, never knew anything. She didn't know about the code. She didn't know what Dexter was. She married into something that was completely hidden from her, and she died because of it. And she never had the information that might have let her make a different choice. Harry's commitment to secrecy didn't just affect the people inside his immediate family. It affected everyone those people touched. I want to say one more thing about the deceptions, which is about the cumulative psychological effect of living inside a constructed story. Dexter's entire sense of self, through at least the first several seasons of the show, is built on a narrative that Harry assembled. He is Dexter Morgan, adopted son of a police officer, shaped by a code, carrying the dark passenger. That's the story. Every piece of that story was chosen for him by Harry. The name, the identity, the framework for understanding his own psychology, even the mythological framing of the dark passenger as something external and separate from his will. What Dexter isn't given is the actual story. That his name was originally Dexter Moser, that his mother died because of a police operation that his father ran, that his brother is alive and in an institution, that the code was co-designed by a psychiatrist who has her own professional interests in its success. All of the information that would allow Dexter to understand his own history accurately is withheld, sometimes indefinitely, sometimes until circumstances force it into the open. Living inside a constructed story is not a neutral thing. It shapes what questions you think to ask, what explanations feel plausible, what understanding of yourself feels available. Dexter spends enormous amounts of his inner life wondering about his nature, where the darkness came from, what it means, whether it can be managed or changed, or whether he's fundamentally something that can't be fixed. And he does all of that wondering without access to significant pieces of the information that would actually help him understand himself. Harry built the house and locked the windows and handed Dexter a map of a different building entirely. This is a section I've thought about the most, and it's the one where I find myself genuinely uncertain about how harshly to read what happened. Because there's a case for Harry here, as there is throughout, but I want to lay it out honestly and let you sit with it. Harry Morgan didn't die of heart disease. That's the official story, the one that Matthews had the autopsy buried to protect. What actually happened was that Harry overdosed on his own heart medication. He killed himself. The timeline of why this happened is reconstructed over season 2, and the key moment is a flashback that Dexter has near the end of the season. He's holding Dokes at a cabin, trying to decide what to do, and Doke says, "Stay away" to him after witnessing something horrific. And those 2 words trigger a memory. 3 days before Harry died, he walked into his garage and found Dexter dismembering the body of Juan Rhinus, a pimp Harry had been trying to put away for years. Dexter had killed him, and Dexter was happy about it. He was cheerful. He presented what he'd done like a child showing a parent something they'd made. "Here, look, I followed the code. I did it right. Aren't you proud of me?" Harry looked at what was on his workbench. He vomited. He said, "Stay away." 3 days later, he was dead. Dexter spends much of season 2 processing this revelation, trying to understand how a man who built the code, who taught him to kill, who prepared him for this life, could then be destroyed by seeing that life in practice. And the conclusion Dexter eventually reaches is that Harry couldn't live with what he had created. The abstraction was bearable. The reality was not. That's a reading with some sympathy in it, and I think the sympathy is earned. There's something genuinely heartbreaking about Harry in that garage, seeing the cheerful dismemberment and realizing what he'd done. The horror on his face as Dexter imagines it reads as real. He wasn't expecting this. He thought the code would contain it, shape it, make it something he could live with at a distance. He was wrong. But here's what I keep returning to. Harry built the machine. He assembled every piece of it with Vogel's blueprints and his own hands. He spent years training Dexter, reinforcing the code, making the killing feel righteous and purposeful and managed. And when the machine ran as designed and when it did exactly what it was built to do, Harry chose to leave. He didn't try to stop it. He didn't go to anyone for help. He didn't tell Matthews what he'd done, or Vogel, or anyone who might have been able to intervene in some way. He just ended himself and left the machine running and left Dexter to carry everything alone. Dexter was, at the point of Harry's death, a young man who had been carefully shaped to be one specific thing. He had no other framework for understanding himself. He had no one else who knew the full truth. Harry was the only person in the world who understood completely what Dexter was and why. And when Harry couldn't handle what he'd made, his response was to disappear from the situation permanently rather than to stay and try to help navigate it. I want to be careful about the language here because suicide is a genuinely complex and tragic thing, and I don't want to be glib about it. Harry was clearly suffering. He had done something that he couldn't reconcile with who he thought he was, and the weight of that was unbearable. That's real, and I don't think it deserves contempt. But I also think that I couldn't handle watching what I created is a different thing from being absolved of responsibility for creating it. The abandonment of Dexter at that moment, not a clean break, not a conversation, just a body found and a cause of death covered up, left Dexter without the one person who could have said something honest. Harry could have told Dexter the truth about his own horror. He could have said, "I made you this, and I'm sorry, and I don't know how to fix it, and here's what I know." He could have left Dexter with something other than an idealized ghost. Instead, he left Dexter with the ghost of a father who had never expressed a single doubt, never shown a moment of uncertainty, never admitted that the project might have been a mistake. The hallucination that Dexter carries through the rest of the series is, by necessity, constructed from the man Dexter thought he knew, not the man who vomited in the garage and took a handful of pills and lay down. Harry's real last words to Dexter were, "Stay away." The last words of the hallucination are usually something measured and calm and instructive. That gap between the real Harry's last act and the mythologized Harry who lives in Dexter's head is worth sitting with for a while. One last thing about the suicide. Matthew says that Harry killed himself partly because the number of criminals benefiting from the flawed justice system became too much for him. That's the official narrative Matthews offers to protect Harry's reputation. It's a heroic story about a good cop overwhelmed by the inadequacies of the system he'd given his life to. It's not wrong exactly, but it's also not the whole truth, and Matthews knew it wasn't the whole truth, and he buried the real autopsy anyway. The code's first rule is don't get caught. Harry, in his final act, followed his own code. There's another reading of the suicide that I want to put on the table because I think it's underexplored in the fandom discussion I've come across. The reading I've been developing is that Harry left, that he chose to die rather than face what he had made. But there's a version of it that's slightly more charitable, which is that Harry died because he genuinely believed he had ruined Dexter and there was nothing to be done about it. In other words, not cowardice, but despair. He looked at that garage and understood, in a way he hadn't fully understood before, that the code hadn't contained anything. It had directed it, shaped it, given it a particular flavor. But Dexter was what Dexter was, and Harry had helped make him that way, and there was no undoing it. And if there was no undoing it, then what exactly was the point of continuing? The project had produced its outcome. Harry's role in it was complete. That's a darker reading than the one the show offers, and possibly a more honest one. The show frames his death as a man overwhelmed by the gap between his ideals and his reality. The alternative framing is a man who saw the reality clearly for the first time and concluded it was unlivable. Both are tragic. They feel different, morally, something else worth noting. The fact that Harry's death was covered up had long-term implications for Dexter's psychological health that are easy to overlook. Because Dexter spent years believing that his father died of heart disease, he mourned that version of Harry, the man who built the code and then faded away from illness. He had a particular relationship to that loss. And when the truth came out in season 2, what Dexter had to do was essentially grieve twice. Once for the father who died, and once for the understanding of why. That's a particular kind of additional injury, delivered posthumously, because Harry couldn't tell the truth even at the end. There's a scene in season 5 where Dexter, who has just watched his wife Rita get murdered by the Trinity killer, is in a motorway services bathroom. He's come face to face with a random man who is rude to him in a spectacularly poorly timed way. And Dexter kills him with a grappling hook. It's impulsive. It's not code compliant. It's just grief expressed as violence. And then Harry appears in the mirror, and Harry says, essentially, that was the first human thing you've done since Rita died. It's okay to show what you're feeling. I've always found that scene fascinating, and not entirely in the way the show seems to intend it, because Harry's ghost there is not telling Dexter to calm down, or to be careful, or to process his grief through legitimate channels. He's telling him it's fine that he just killed someone in a fit of emotion. He's validating an impulsive murder as an acceptable expression of feeling. That's the code's conscience at work. The hallucination of Harry runs through all 8 seasons of the original series, and it's worth looking carefully at what it actually does versus what the show frames it as doing. The show frames it as Dexter's conscience, the internalized voice of his moral father, keeping him honest, keeping him tethered to some version of a value system. And sometimes it functions that way. When Dexter is about to make a decision that would cross a serious line, Harry's face shows up and asks questions that make Dexter reconsider. But a lot of the time, what Harry's hallucination does is reinforce the code's priorities, which, as we've already established, are not primarily moral ones. He warns Dexter about getting caught. He helps Dexter rationalize decisions. He tells Dexter what Dexter needs to hear in order to keep functioning. He is, in a very real sense, a coping mechanism wearing a face, and the face happens to belong to the person who designed the coping mechanism in the first place. There's a scene in Season 8 where the hallucination addresses the dark passenger question, the idea that Dexter has always carried of some external force inside him driving the killing, something separate from his own will. Harry's ghost, in this late-season conversation, says something remarkable. He suggests that maybe the dark passenger is just a feeling. Maybe it's not external at all. And Dexter says he can't accept that because if the dark passenger isn't real, then he's responsible for everything he's done. And Harry says, yes, it is a lot simpler to blame something else, isn't it? This is the most honest the hallucination ever is. And even here, it's performing a function. It's pushing Dexter toward a more accurate understanding of his own psychology, which is useful because it happens to align with what Dexter needs in order to move forward in that particular storyline. The honesty is instrumentalized. The ghost is always in service of the narrative Dexter needs to survive. What's most interesting about the Harry hallucination, though, is what it can't do. It can't actually challenge the foundational premise. It can nudge Dexter toward or away from particular decisions, can inflect the code with different emphasis as situations change, but it cannot say the whole thing was a mistake. It cannot tell Dexter that the system itself might be wrong, because if it did, the show would have to reckon with that, and for most of the series, it's not ready to. The hallucination is Harry as Dexter needed him to be, which is also Harry as the show needs him to be. He's the moral anchor in a story that would otherwise have no anchor at all. And anchors are useful, but they are not the same thing as the truth. They just stop you drifting. By the time of Resurrection, the sequel series that picks up after New Blood, Harry appears again as a spectral presence. Dexter survived, it turns out, and Harry is still there. Still in dialogue, still inescapable, which is either a good piece of character continuity or a fairly bleak observation about whether Dexter will ever be free of his father's framework. Probably both. The real Harry Morgan died telling Dexter to stay away. The hallucination Harry Morgan never went away at all. Dexter got one for the rest of his life, whether he wanted it or not. There's something almost poetic about that, if you're in the mood for it. The man who built a prison for his son also became the prison's permanent resident guard. Since we're talking about the hallucination, I want to note something about how it changes across the series, because it's not static, and the way it changes tells you something. In the early seasons, the hallucination Harry is almost entirely instructional. He shows up to reinforce or complicate the code's application to specific situations. He's essentially a living FAQ for the rule set. In the middle seasons, he starts to be a bit more emotional. There are moments where the Harry of Dexter's imagination expresses something closer to genuine feeling, regret or concern or affection, in ways that the actual Harry we see in flashbacks doesn't always match. And by the later seasons, the hallucination starts to be challenged, questioned, pushed back against by Dexter himself. That arc is interesting because it tracks Dexter's own psychological development, however limited and fitful that development is. The early Dexter needs the rule book, so Harry is the rule book. The middle Dexter is starting to have relationships and feelings that the code doesn't cover, so Harry becomes more emotional to accommodate that. The late Dexter is starting to question the foundational premise of his own identity, so Harry starts to say more complicated things. None of that is Harry. All of that is Dexter, using his father's face to process his own evolution. There's a philosophical question buried in here about what it means to have a relationship with someone only through the version of them that lives in your head. Dexter's entire understanding of Harry is mediated through memory and construction. He has access to the real Harry only through flashbacks, and flashbacks are not neutral records. They're recalled from a particular perspective, at a particular time, for a particular purpose. The Dexter who remembers Harry in Season 1 is not the same person as the Dexter who remembers Harry in Season 7, and so the Harrys they remember are subtly different people. This means that the Harry who functions as Dexter's conscience has, in some sense, been edited by Dexter to serve the role Dexter needs him to serve. Which is a very lonely thing when you think about it. Dexter's most important relationship is with a person he's partially invented using the raw material of someone who died before he could really know him. There is something I find genuinely moving about the later seasons' treatment of the hallucination, which I want to acknowledge even while I have been fairly critical of what the hallucination represents. By season 6 and 7, when Dexter starts to really interrogate his own nature, there are moments where the hallucination Harry is clearly not sufficient. He doesn't have answers for what Dexter is becoming, because Dexter is becoming something that Harry's framework didn't anticipate. The code was built for a particular version of Dexter's life and a particular set of circumstances, and as those circumstances change and Dexter changes with them, the Harry in his head starts to feel like a slightly outdated reference book. There is a poignancy to that. The man who was supposed to be Dexter's moral anchor starts to feel, by the later seasons, like an anchor in the literal and slightly less flattering sense. Something that holds you in place, that resists movement, that was necessary once but has become a limitation. Dexter keeps consulting the hallucination even when his answers do not quite fit the questions, because what else does he have? The real Harry is decades dead. The hallucination Harry is all that is left. That specific quality, being guided by an inadequate framework because no better framework was ever offered, seems to me like one of the more accurate descriptions of what it is like to be shaped by someone else's idea of who you should be and then left with it after they are gone. Harry gave Dexter a map. The terrain kept changing, the map stayed the same. Deborah Morgan is, in my honest opinion, the most tragic character in the Dexter franchise. Not Dexter, who is also tragic, but who at least gets to be the protagonist, who at least gets the voiceover and the cool music and the show's fundamental love and sympathy. Deborah is the one who just keeps absorbing consequences she didn't choose, ripple effects of other people's decisions landing on her again and again across 8 seasons of television until there's very little of her left. And the source of most of those ripple effects, when you trace them back, is Harry. Let's start at the beginning. Deborah grew up in a household where Harry and Dexter had an intense, private bond that she was excluded from. She didn't know what the bond was about. She couldn't because Harry kept the code and everything surrounding it secret. But she felt the exclusion. She was the one on the outside of the closed door. She spent her childhood and adolescence and early adulthood feeling slightly secondary, slightly less loved, slightly less central to her father's attention than her adopted brother was, and she couldn't even understand why because no one would tell her. She then spent her entire career at Miami Metro in Harry's shadow. He was a legend there. She was Harry Morgan's daughter, trying to earn a name of her own in the same institution, constantly measured against someone who got to be mythologized because he wasn't around to disappoint anyone anymore. That's an exhausting thing to be. She pushed herself constantly, took risks, accepted cases others wouldn't touch, became genuinely excellent at her job, and still found herself measured against a ghost that kept getting better with every passing year. And then came Brian Moser. The ice truck killer selected Deborah as his victim, or his audience, or something between the two. The show is somewhat ambiguous about Brian's exact intentions. He pursued a romantic relationship with her under a false identity. She fell for him genuinely. He brought her to the very house where Laura Moser had lived. He nearly killed her. This is the consequence of Harry concealing Brian's existence and the full circumstances of the Moser case. The secret grew a life of its own, and the life it grew walked into Deborah's life wearing a name tag that said Rudy Cooper. None of that happens if Harry tells the truth. If Deborah knew that Dexter had a biological brother who had survived the container, who had been institutionalized, who was out there somewhere, she would have at minimum been aware that such a person existed. The specific way Brian attacked her exploited her complete ignorance. Her ignorance was Harry's creation. Then there's the discovery in season 7. Deborah walks into a church and finds her brother stabbing someone. She has to process, in real time, the fact that Dexter is a serial killer, that her father knew, that the code is real, that the last 20-something years of her understanding of her family is built on a foundation that was never what she thought it was. She doesn't handle this well, reasonably enough. She spends most of season 7 oscillating between wanting to turn Dexter in and being unable to go through with it, covering for him, lying to colleagues, compromising herself step by step. By the season 7 finale, she shoots La Guerta. She kills a colleague, an innocent woman who was actually right about Dexter and had followed the evidence honestly and professionally to its correct conclusion. Deborah commits murder to protect her brother, and the brother's secret, and by extension, the father's legacy. And she does it in a shipping container, which is either a choice by the writers or a remarkable coincidence. But either way, it's an image that lands. La Guerta's death breaks Deborah in ways that are visible through all of season 8. She can't come back from it. She quits the police force. She spirals into substance use, into a self-destructiveness that reads clearly as someone who has lost the things she used to know herself by. She became a cop because of Harry. She defined herself by his values, his standards, his institution. And now she's the person who committed murder in that institution's name, and she can't square those two things. Season 8 has Deborah shot by Oliver Saxon. She survives initially, but suffers a fatal stroke. Dexter disconnects her from life support and buries her at sea, which is both a loving act and a haunting echo of every other body he's disposed of. Deborah Morgan died because of a sequence of events that her father set in motion before she was old enough to have any say in them. She didn't choose to be Dexter's sister. She didn't choose to grow up in Harry's orbit. She didn't choose to be kept ignorant of the things that most needed her to be informed. She didn't choose any of it. She just lived inside it until it killed her. Harry loved Deborah. I want to say that clearly. He loved her in the way fathers love daughters, with pride and protectiveness and genuine warmth. The moments in the flashbacks where Harry interacts with young Deborah are not performative. There's real affection there. But love and accountability are different things, and Harry's love for Deborah did not extend to giving her the basic tools she needed to protect herself from the consequences of his choices. He kept her in the dark because he thought the dark was safer. He was wrong. The dark was where all the things he was hiding were waiting for her. I want to stay with season 7's finale for a moment longer because the shipping container detail genuinely stops me every time. Deborah shoots La Guerta in a shipping container. The location is almost certainly a deliberate callback by the writers to the origin of everything. To the shipping container at the port of Miami where Laura Moser died, where two small boys watched something they could never unsee. The container at the docks is where the chain of causation starts. The container in the finale of season 7 is where the chain of causation reaches Deborah, the person who is supposedly the furthest from all of it, Harry's biological daughter, the one who was supposed to be protected. She was not protected, she was just reached later. There's also something worth saying about the specific emotional texture of Deborah's relationship with Harry's memory. She idolized him in a way that was visibly affecting her long before she found out the truth about Dexter. She measured her career against his. She invoked his standards when she was uncertain. She used his reputation as a kind of internal compass. And all of that idolization was built on a myth, because the Harry she thought she knew was not the Harry who existed. When the myth starts to crack, when she learns about Laura, when she learns about Dexter, when she begins to understand that the man she'd been measuring herself against had built a secret world inside her own family, the cracking doesn't happen cleanly. It would be easier if it did. Instead, she holds the two Harrys in tension. The father she loved and the man who lied to her. She defends him out of one side of her mouth and acknowledges the betrayal out of the other. That's not inconsistency. That's what it actually feels like when someone you love turns out to have been something other than what you thought. Quinn notices this about Deborah at various points. Lundy notices it. The people around her can see that she's carrying something that she can't quite name, and that it's making her make decisions that aren't good for her. What they can't see is that what she's carrying is the weight of a family she never fully understood, shaped by choices she was never told about, pulling her toward consequences she never consented to. There's a small moment in season 4 that I think about more than it probably warrants, but that feels to me like it captures something essential about Deborah's situation. She's at work and a woman named Valerie comes up to her and mentions casually that she knew Harry, that she was one of his CIs, that he was good to her, that she's still a bit hurt that he moved on to another informant, and Deborah just stands there absorbing this, adding it to a picture of her father that keeps getting more complicated the more people fill it in. She can't confront Harry, he's dead. She can't ask him to explain himself or justify his choices. She can only keep collecting pieces of a portrait she never commissioned and doesn't fully know what to do with. And the portrait that keeps emerging is of a man who was charming, who was good at his job, who was capable of real warmth, and who also had a pattern of behavior that didn't always square with the man she thought she knew. That's a genuinely disorienting thing to live with. To love someone who turns out to have been more complicated than you understood, and to be unable to do anything with that complication because the person is no longer available for conversation, is a specific kind of grief. It's the grief of a revised understanding, which doesn't have a clean name the way that ordinary grief does, but is just as real and considerably harder to resolve. Deborah's whole arc, if you squint at it from a certain angle, is an attempt to resolve the irresolvable, to find a way to hold on to the Harry she loved while integrating the Harry she's learning about. She never quite manages it. The revision is always incomplete, always ongoing, always destabilizing something she thought was settled, and she dies with it still unresolved, which is perhaps the most honest thing the show could have done with her story. If you wanted to trace the full cost of Harry Morgan's decisions, you'd need a fairly large piece of paper. What I want to do in this section is just walk through some of the major downstream consequences. Not to construct a comprehensive ledger, because the show is complicated enough that any ledger would be incomplete, but to give a sense of how far the ripple goes. Start with Rita. Rita Bennett married Dexter Morgan because she fell in love with him, and because Dexter was, in a lot of ways, genuinely good to her. He was patient, he was caring in his own fashion, he was good with her children from her first marriage. The relationship wasn't a fraud in any simple sense, but Rita also married someone she didn't know. She married a man whose inner life was a complete mystery to her, who was carrying a secret that shaped every decision he made, who had been shaped by Harry's code into someone incapable of full honesty with anyone he loved. Harry's code gave Dexter the tools to maintain a normal life on the surface while conducting a completely different life underneath. Without those tools, Dexter doesn't hold a job, doesn't have a relationship, doesn't have a family. With those tools, he has all of those things, and Rita has no idea what she's married into. Rita was murdered by Arthur Mitchell in the season 4 finale. Dexter had the opportunity to kill Mitchell earlier and delayed, partly because he was fascinated by Mitchell's ability to maintain a family while being a serial killer, which is itself a consequence of Harry's framework. The idea that Dexter might be able to learn something about how to balance these two lives. The delay cost Rita her life. Their infant son, Harrison, was found sitting in her blood on the bathroom floor, in an image that deliberately echoes the shipping container, the source of everything. Harrison Morgan is, in some ways, the clearest symbol of what Harry's legacy actually produces across generations. He grows up the son of a serial killer who was shaped by the code his grandfather built. In New Blood, Harrison tracks Dexter down in Iron Lake, New York, where Dexter has been living under a false name with his urges supposedly suppressed. The reunion does not go well. Harrison has his own darkness, possibly inherited, possibly just the consequence of a childhood defined by loss and violence. And the series ends with Harrison shooting Dexter, who tells his son it's the right thing to do. Let me sit with that for a moment. The Code of Harry was designed to contain one generation's violence. What it actually produced across the franchise is a lineage of violence that passes from Harry's decisions to Dexter's existence to Harrison's arrival at a gun pointed at his father. 3 generations of consequence from one man's choices. There's also Lagerta, who is worth mentioning as a consequence not of any action Dexter directly took, but of the institutional web Harry built around his secrets. Lagerta was a competent homicide lieutenant who followed the evidence on the Bay Harbor butcher case with genuine professional rigor and arrived at the correct conclusion. Dexter Morgan was the killer. She was right. And she was killed because of it. Because the network of protection that Harry had established, Matthews covering up the suicide, the institutional loyalty to Harry's legacy, the complicit silence of everyone who knew or suspected, had created a situation where someone doing their job correctly became a threat that Dexter's circle had to eliminate. Lagerta didn't die because of a mistake. She died because Harry built something that made telling the truth about it dangerous. Then there's New Blood and Original Sin, which are worth looking at together because they bracket the Harry question from different angles. Original Sin, as a prequel, shows you the construction of the code from the inside. Harry actively guiding young Dexter toward his first kills, building the framework piece by piece, being an active participant in the creation of a killer rather than a passive recipient of circumstances. It makes it harder to read Harry's role as purely reactive. He was building something, it was deliberate. New Blood shows you where the thing he built ultimately lands. Dexter, having spent a decade suppressing his urges in a small town in upstate New York, gets rediscovered by his son and eventually killed by him. Harrison's final act, shooting Dexter with Dexter's consent, is explicitly framed as an attempt to end the cycle, to do what Dexter never managed, which is to stop, to not pass the thing on. Harrison is, at the end of New Blood, the surviving inheritor of Harry's project. He has his father's darkness, or something like it. He has his father's face and his grandfather's framework and a whole franchise's worth of trauma behind him. Resurrection picks that up, presumably. There's a word for what Harry built, if you're looking for one. A legacy is what you leave behind on purpose. What Harry left behind was something larger and more complicated and considerably less controllable than that. It was a system that produced consequences nobody fully planned for, that spread through lives and institutions and generations, that is still spreading as far as the franchise continues to run. That's not a legacy, that's an inheritance nobody asked for. I want to pause for a moment on the Rita death specifically because I think it's the most concrete single instance of Harry's legacy producing a catastrophic outcome in real time. And it's worth being precise about the chain of causation. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer, is one of the show's most genuinely frightening antagonists. John Lithgow gives a performance that should have won every award available. But the reason Dexter doesn't kill Mitchell when he has the opportunity, early in season 4, is specifically because Dexter is fascinated by Mitchell's ability to maintain a family life while being a killer. Dexter wants to learn from him. He sees in Mitchell a possible answer to the question of how to have the life Harry built the code to enable. A normal family, a cover, a functional existence alongside the killing. That fascination, that specific desire to understand how someone else managed the same balance Harry constructed for Dexter is entirely a product of Harry's framework. If there had been no code, no deliberate cultivation of the idea that Dexter could be a killer and a functioning family man simultaneously, Dexter has no reason to study Mitchell as a model. He kills him when he first gets the chance and goes home. Instead, he waits, and Rita dies. And Harrison is found in a pool of her blood, which echoes the container at the docks, which echoes Laura Moser's death, which echoes Harry's original choices. The echo chamber of consequence that Harry's decision set up runs through the entire season 4 finale, producing the image of an infant in blood that mirrors the image of a toddler in blood from 30 years earlier. Harry wanted to break the cycle. He wanted to give Dexter a framework that would allow him to have a life without producing more victims. What he actually produced was a framework that generated more victims at one remove, Not Dexter's direct victims, but the people in Dexter's orbit who paid the price for his ongoing survival. Rita is the clearest example. La Guerta is another. Dokes is another. The list is longer than the show fully reckons with. I want to say something about the structural choice in New Blood to have Harrison be the one who ends Dexter, because I think it's the most direct comment the franchise has made on Harry's project and what it actually accomplished. Harrison arrives in Iron Lake already damaged. He spent his childhood with no father, growing up in the shadow of a secret he didn't know but could feel. And he's clearly brought his own darkness with him. Whether inherited or circumstantial is something New Blood leaves deliberately ambiguous. When he finds Dexter and learns who his father really is, he goes through a compressed version of what Deborah went through over 7 seasons. The love, the horror, the impossible attempt to hold both at once. And then he shoots Dexter, with Dexter's permission. With Dexter's instruction, more or less. Because Dexter looks at his son and sees the cycle and understands, finally, genuinely, that the code is not a way of ending the cycle. It's a way of perpetuating it with better aesthetics. Harry wanted the code to be the thing that stopped the damage from spreading. He wanted the controlled channel to be enough. Dexter's final act of allowing Harrison to shoot him is, in a sense, an acknowledgement that Harry was wrong. That the only way to stop the thing Harry built was to stop Dexter himself. That the code was never a solution. It was a very well-designed delay. New Blood also does something interesting with the Harry mythology in a more direct way, which is that the Harry hallucination is still present in Iron Lake, still appearing, still commenting. Dexter has been using the code in this new life, still following the rules, still arguing with his dead father's voice inside his head. A decade of apparent suppression, and Harry's framework is still the lens through which Dexter understands himself. You don't build something that's central to someone's identity and have it go away. You build it, and it stays. Which is ultimately the truest thing about Harry's legacy. It doesn't stop, it keeps going. It's in Dexter's head in a snowy upstate town 10 years after the events of the original series, and it's in Harrison's hands when Harrison has to decide whether his father's worth saving. And it'll presumably be somewhere in the background of Resurrection as Dexter navigates whatever comes next. Harry Morgan has been dead since before the show started. He has never left. This is the part where I try to argue the other side because I think it's important and because the argument isn't nothing. Harry Morgan was a man who got handed an impossible situation and had to make decisions in real time with incomplete information in an era when the resources available to help him were genuinely limited. That matters. The context of when and where this happened shapes what was actually possible. The late 1970s and early 1980s are not 2025. The understanding of childhood trauma, of developmental psychology, of what early intervention with severely traumatized children could actually look like was in a very different place. The psychiatric and psychological resources available to a working police officer in Miami trying to deal with a child who showed signs of what we would now call complex PTSD combined with what appeared to be early psychopathic traits were not particularly impressive. Institutions were one option, medication was another. Long-term specialized residential care was possible but expensive, and in many cases not much better than the institutions it replaced. Harry's options realistically were try to manage this at home, commit Dexter to an institutional setting, or find another way. He chose the third option, which is genuinely unusual. He didn't give up. He didn't farm the problem out and wash his hands of it. He kept his son and invested in him. And the investment was real. Whatever you think of the code as a moral framework, it did something. Dexter grew up as a functional human being, employed, capable of relationships, capable of making certain kinds of decisions that reflect genuine care for people. Without any framework at all, that probably doesn't happen. The code gave Dexter something to organize his life around, and something to organize your life around turns out to be fairly important for most people. There's also the fact that Harry acted out of love, and I don't want to dismiss that. The flashbacks to Harry with young Dexter have a warmth and specificity to them that doesn't read as performed. He genuinely cared about this child. He spent time with him, taught him things, built rituals around their relationship, took him fishing and to crime scenes and to all the places where a father and son might be together. He made Dexter feel seen and understood in a way that Dexter clearly never experienced elsewhere. That's not a small thing, particularly for a child who had experienced what Dexter experienced. To have one person who didn't flinch, who didn't look at you as broken, who said there is a place in the world for you, even if the way that place was constructed was problematic, that person genuinely mattered. Dexter loved Harry. The love is real in both directions. The decision about Brian is harder to defend, and I want to acknowledge that I've been fairly hard on it. But there's a case to be made here too. A family with an infant daughter, Deborah, and two newly acquired traumatized older boys, one of whom had just nearly smothered the infant, was a genuinely dangerous situation. Harry didn't have good options. He could not both protect Deborah and keep Brian in the house. That's a real constraint. Maybe better follow-up with Brian's care would have been possible and should have happened, but the initial decision to remove Brian from a household where he'd already demonstrated he was a danger to other children is not straightforwardly wrong. And then there's the argument that Vogel made, which has some merit even if it also serves her interests. Without the code, Dexter likely does end up incarcerated or executed. The code gave him a framework for survival. The alternative may genuinely have been worse. We can't know for certain, and the alternative would have been worse, is a claim that's impossible to verify, but it's not obviously false. Harry was also deeply uncomfortable with what he'd created, which is at least evidence that he hadn't entirely lost his moral compass. The vomiting, the stay away, the suicide. These are the responses of someone who understood, finally and too late, that something had gone wrong. He wasn't proud of what he'd made, he was destroyed by it. That's not the behavior of someone who didn't care. And yet here we are at the end of the Steel Man, and I find I keep bumping into the same problem, which is that Harry had the ability to make different choices at almost every critical juncture, and he consistently chose the option that was easier for him. The affair with Laura was easier than maintaining professional boundaries. Abandoning Brian was easier than fighting for his care. Building the code was easier than pursuing less convenient forms of help. Keeping the secrets was easier than telling the truth. Dying was easier than facing what he'd made. That pattern doesn't erase the love or the good intentions. But it does say something about the man underneath the myth. I should also say something about the specific historical context of the psychiatric options available to Harry, because I think it's easy to assume that things were simply better and that Harry just chose not to pursue them. The treatment of severe childhood trauma in the early 1980s in the context of a child showing signs of what we would now classify as psychopathy was genuinely limited. The concept of trauma-informed care as a specific and developed clinical approach didn't exist in its current form. The research base for treating children with significant violent ideation was thin. The institutional options, residential psychiatric facilities, long-term care homes, were often as traumatizing as the conditions they were designed to treat. This is not an era in which you could simply Google a specialist and book an appointment. Harry went to Vogel because Vogel was apparently the best available resource for exactly this kind of case. She had studied psychopathy in children, she had worked with families in similar situations, she had some kind of track record. That Harry ended up at Vogel's door is not evidence of laziness or limited searching. It's evidence that the options were narrow and he took the best one he could find. What he did with what Vogel offered him is a different question. But the initial decision to seek help, to go beyond his own knowledge and reach out to a specialist, that's genuinely better than doing nothing, and it's better than the number of alternatives he could have chosen. There's also something I want to say about the code's actual effect on Dexter's targets, which is easy to lose sight of given how critical I've been of the code's function. The people Dexter kills under the code are, by his own rigorous vetting, genuinely guilty of murders they escaped punishment for. They are not random, they are not innocent. The code does produce something, not justice in any formal sense, but a kind of accounting for lives that would otherwise go unaccounted for. Harry wanted Dexter's violence to mean something, to be aimed somewhere, and in the specific sense that it is aimed at people who would otherwise continue to harm others, it does mean something. That's real. It's also not sufficient to excuse everything else, but it's real. And one thing I genuinely think is worth giving Harry credit for, which often gets lost in the critical readings, is that he appears to have been honest with Dexter about what Dexter was, or honest enough anyway. The code could easily have been built around a more comfortable lie. That the urges were something Dexter could eventually overcome, that they would fade with time and practice and the right framework, that one day he might be a person who didn't need the code anymore. That would have been a kindly deception, and one that would have been very easy to offer a traumatized child. Harry didn't do that. He told Dexter, in whatever terms were appropriate to a child of that age, that this was who he was, that the thing inside him was real and wasn't going away, that the code wasn't a cure but a management strategy. He gave Dexter a realistic picture of his own situation, at least in terms of what Harry understood of it, and he told him that the situation was survivable. That's not nothing. One of the most damaging things you can do to someone who is struggling is tell them they're fine, that it's all manageable, that they'll get through it if they just try hard enough. Harry didn't do that. He looked at Dexter and said, "I see what's in you, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't there. Barsh, and we're going to figure out together what to do with it." That's a particular kind of honesty that requires a particular kind of courage, and Harry had it. The tragedy is that the together part didn't last. I've been sitting with this question for a long time, and I want to try to give you an honest answer, which is, I think it depends on what you need a villain to look like. If you need a villain to have malicious intent, to be doing what he's doing out of cruelty or self-interest or the desire to cause harm, then Harry Morgan is not your villain. He was not cruel. He did not want to hurt anyone. He made his choices out of a complicated mixture of love, guilt, pragmatism, and self-preservation, and the balance between those things shifted depending on the decision. That's not villainy in any traditional sense. If you need a villain to be aware of what he's doing and do it anyway, it's more complicated. Harry knew on some level that what he was building was ethically difficult. He went to Vogel because he knew he needed help making it work. He kept the secrets because he knew they were the kind of secrets that cause damage when they come out. He died because he couldn't live with what he'd seen, which means he understood what he'd seen was terrible. He wasn't operating in ignorance. If you think about what villainy actually looks like in ordinary life, not in action films, not in procedural dramas where there's always a person you can catch and prosecute, but in the real texture of how people cause serious harm to each other, it usually looks something like Harry. It looks like a sequence of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time, taken by someone who genuinely believed they were doing their best, producing consequences that spread far beyond what anyone intended or anticipated. Nobody sits down and says, "I'm going to build something that destroys 3 generations of a family." It happens through 100 smaller choices that all seem survivable at the moment of making them. Harry Morgan is interesting as a character precisely because he doesn't fit the template we use for fictional wrongdoing. He's not Trinity, who is methodical and predatory and frightening. He's not the ice truck killer who is disturbed in the way that makes for good television. He's a man who loved his son, told himself he was protecting his family, and made choices that echoed outward for decades. That's a much quieter kind of damage. And in some ways, it's more recognizable than the kind the show usually asks us to look at. There's one more thing I want to say about Harry, and it's this. The show, across its entire run, is quite explicit about Dexter's damage, his inability to connect, his reliance on the code, his tendency to use people instrumentally, his relationship to violence as a thing that feels like relief rather than horror. All of this is examined from multiple angles across multiple seasons, and the show consistently connects it to the trauma of the shipping container. What Dexter saw as a very small child made him what he is. That's the show's central psychological argument. But the shipping container was not random. It was a downstream consequence of Harry Morgan's choices. Harry's affair with Laura, his use of her as the CI, his management of a dangerous operation in which she was the most exposed party. These are the things that put Laura Moser in danger. And Laura Moser's death is what put Dexter in the container. And the container is what made Dexter what he is. The show wants you to see Harry as the person who mitigated the damage of the container. I've been arguing for the past hour or so that Harry is also the person who produced the conditions that made the container possible. Both of those things can be true. Often the most complicated relationships are the ones where the same person is both the source of the wound and the person trying to bandage it. Harry Morgan is not the villain of Dexter in the way that the show uses that word, but he's also not the hero that the myth requires him to be. He's something in between, which is where most of the people who cause serious harm in the real world tend to live. In the space between good intentions and bad outcomes, in the distance between who they told themselves they were and what they actually did. The Code of Harry asked Dexter to take responsibility for his own actions by wrapping them in a moral framework. Harry never fully took responsibility for his. He died with his secrets intact, his reputation protected, and his ghost still in residence inside his son's head. That's not villainous exactly, but it's something. I want to end on something about the show's structure that I think is relevant here, because I don't think it's accidental. Dexter is built around a question the show never quite answers directly, which is whether Dexter is responsible for what he is, or whether he is what he was made. The dark passenger mythology, the idea that there is something external living inside him, driving him, is there specifically to allow the question to stay open. If the dark passenger is real, Dexter is a victim of his own nature, and Harry is the man who gave him tools to cope. If the dark passenger is not real, if it's just a convenient fiction Dexter uses to avoid facing his own desires, then Harry is the man who built the fiction and handed it to his son as a house to live in. By season 8, the show leans toward the second reading. Harry's hallucination says so explicitly. And if that's the reading, if the dark passenger is Dexter's own choice, dressed up in the language of compulsion because compulsion is easier to live with than desire, then Harry's role in maintaining that fiction for decades is something darker than protective fatherhood. He told Dexter that what he was came from outside him, that it wasn't his fault, that it was something to be managed rather than something to be examined. That might have been well-intentioned. It also might have been the thing that made it hardest for Dexter to ever get genuinely better. The hallucination Harry in the season 8 conversation says, "It sure is a lot simpler to just pin all the blame on something else." He's right, and he should know. He spent his whole life doing exactly that. What I keep returning to in the end is the question of what kind of story this is, because the genre matters. In a crime procedural, the villain is someone you catch. In a thriller, the villain is someone you outwit. In a tragedy, the villain is sometimes structural, a set of circumstances, a flaw in a person or a system that produces inevitable harm regardless of intention. Dexter is, at its best, a tragedy. And Harry Morgan is a tragic figure in the specific sense that his greatest qualities and his most damaging choices are not separable. His love for Dexter is real, and it produces harm. His competence as a police officer is real, and he uses it to bury things that should see daylight. His guilt about Laura Moser is real, and it produces an adoption that is partly motivated by something other than the child's welfare. The harm is inside the love, always. You can't extract one from the other and evaluate them separately because they were made together. That's the most uncomfortable kind of harm to reckon with because it resists the frameworks we usually use. Harry was not a bad person who did good things occasionally. He was a person whose genuine goodness and genuine care were entangled at every critical moment with choices that protected him at other people's expense. That entanglement is what makes him interesting as a character and what makes him, I think, the most quietly troubling figure in the whole franchise. The show wants to give him a eulogy, and the eulogy is earned in some ways. He was loved, and he loved back, and the world of Dexter would look completely different without him. But eulogies are not the same as accountings. They leave things out. By design, Harry Morgan deserves an accounting. This has been an attempt at one. Actually, since we have a bit of time, let me say one more thing about Dexter as a franchise and why the Harry question matters beyond just this one show. One of the things that makes long-running television interesting as a medium is what happens when a show runs long enough to start contradicting its own mythology. Dexter began as a show where Harry was the unambiguous moral foundation. The code was the thing that separated Dexter from the other killers. Harry was the person who made that code possible. That was the arrangement. But as the show went on, and as the writers kept finding new ways to complicate Dexter's world, the Harry mythology started to develop cracks. The suicide, the Vogel revelation, the Brian backstory, original sin filling in the prequel years in ways that made Harry's active participation in Dexter's development harder to read as purely reactive. Each of these additions made the mythology more interesting and simultaneously made Harry harder to defend. The show got richer by getting less comfortable. That is, I think, the honest arc of how audiences tend to relate to Dexter as a whole. The early seasons ask you to accept the premise and root for the character and not look too hard at the edges. The later seasons, at their best, start pulling at those edges themselves, and the expansions, New Blood, Original Sin, continue that process, asking what it actually means to be the person Harry made, to carry forward a framework you did not choose, to try to break a cycle that was designed into you from the beginning. Harry is the beginning of all of that. He is, in a structural sense, the show's original sin, the one whose choices set the chain in motion, who is in some sense responsible for every subsequent event, and who is also genuinely gone before the consequences fully arrive. That combination of foundational responsibility and convenient absence is, I think, what makes him so endlessly interesting to think about. Anyway, that is genuinely all I have tonight. Thank you for staying with it this long. Anyway, that's Harry Morgan, a man the show loved, a man Dexter loved, a man whose decisions touched everything and answered for almost none of it, a man who built something to manage an impossible situation and then couldn't watch it run, a man who, by almost any honest accounting, caused an enormous amount of damage to an enormous number of people while genuinely believing he was doing his best. Whether that makes him the villain probably depends on how strictly you use the word. I've got a lot more of these if you're the sort of person who falls asleep to exactly this kind of slow, meandering television analysis, which apparently some people are, and I find that genuinely charming. There's something I've been thinking about doing on Deborah Morgan as a standalone. She deserves the full treatment, separately from Dexter, separately from Harry. And Original Sin opened up a lot of questions about the early formation of the code that I haven't fully worked through yet. For now, though, hope that was a comfortable hour or two. Sleep well.